He built one of America's biggest cable companies. His family treated it like a personal ATM. In the summer of 2002, federal agents arrested two men outside a Manhattan apartment building. The men were not career criminals. They were not strangers to the system. One was 77 years old, a founder of one of America's largest cable television companies, a man who had built his business from a single franchise in rural Pennsylvania over 50 years. The other was his son, the company's chief financial officer. They were arrested in their pajamas. The charges against them, and against three other members of the same family, described a fraud so brazen, so personal, and so entangled with ordinary family life that prosecutors struggled to explain where the company ended and the family began. This is the story of John Rygas and Adelphia Communications. To understand Adelphia, you need to understand what John Rygas actually built, because it was genuinely remarkable before it became genuinely corrupt. Rygas was born in 1924 to Greek immigrant parents in Wellsville, New York. His father ran a diner. John served in the Army during World War II, studied at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, and in 1952, with a small loan and a borrowed idea, purchased the cable television franchise rights for Coudersport, Pennsylvania, a town of approximately 2,600 people in a remote corner of the state. Cable television was in its infancy, and most people in the industry considered rural Pennsylvania an unlikely place to build a business. Rygas saw it differently. Over the following decades, he expanded systematically, acquiring cable franchises across rural and suburban markets, building infrastructure in communities that the major broadcasters largely ignored, and developing a reputation as an operator who actually delivered on his promises to local governments and communities. Adelphia Communications, named after the Greek word for brothers, reflecting the family values Rygas said were at the heart of the business, grew steadily from a single county franchise into a regional cable operator, then into a national one. By 2002, Adelphia was the sixth largest cable company in the United States, serving approximately 5.7 million subscribers across more than 30 states. The family dimension of the business was central to its identity from the beginning. Rygas brought his sons into the company as it grew. Timothy became chief financial officer. Michael became executive vice president for operations. James handled the cable systems in Los Angeles. His son-in-law Peter Vanitas also held a senior management role. The Rygas family collectively controlled the company through a dual-class share structure that gave them voting power far exceeding their economic ownership, a governance arrangement that was legal, but that critics would later identify as having eliminated the practical ability of outside shareholders to hold the family accountable. This concentration of family control was not unusual in the cable industry of the 1980s and 1990s, where many companies had been built by founder-operators who retained dominant voting power even after listing publicly. But at Adelphia, the family control went beyond governance to encompass something far more problematic: a systematic blurring of the boundary between the company's assets and the family's personal finances. The Rygas family used Adelphia's credit facilities to borrow billions of dollars through entities they controlled personally, with those borrowings guaranteed by Adelphia, but never properly disclosed to Adelphia's shareholders as obligations of the company. The borrowed money flowed freely between the family's various personal ventures and living expenses and the company's operations, in a pattern that investigators later described as treating the publicly listed company as a personal financial reservoir to an extent unprecedented in American corporate history. The astonishing thing was not that this happened. It was how long it happened before anyone outside the family fully understood the scale of it, despite the fact that Adelphia was a publicly listed company subject to regular disclosure requirements and external auditing. The specific details of what the Rygas family used Adelphia's money for became, during the criminal proceedings and civil litigation that followed the collapse, almost as damaging as the aggregate fraud figure itself. The $2.3 billion in undisclosed debt was the headline number, but behind it was a catalog of personal expenditures that illustrated in granular detail how completely the family had come to regard Adelphia's resources as their own. Adelphia paid for the construction and maintenance of a golf course on land owned by John Rygas personally. The company paid for Christmas trees delivered to the family's private properties. It paid the salaries of personal staff working at the family's homes. It funded a family Christmas party that cost over $1 million. It provided limousines and aircraft for personal travel. It paid $13 million to help purchase a New York City apartment for one of the Rygas' sons. It funded the purchase of timber rights on property the family owned. And, in what became one of the most widely cited details of the entire case, Adelphia paid approximately $252 million to help the Rygas family cover margin calls on their personal stock holdings, essentially using shareholder money to protect the family's own investment positions in the company whose shareholders they were defrauding. Timothy Rygas, as CFO, was central to the mechanism by which this was accomplished. The undisclosed debt was maintained through what were called co-borrowing arrangements, credit facilities that Adelphia established jointly with Rygas' family-controlled entities, under which the family could borrow using Adelphia's credit, but the borrowings appeared on the family entity's books rather than on Adelphia's consolidated balance sheet. This structure meant that Adelphia's public financial statements did not reflect the full extent of the debt obligations the company had effectively guaranteed, and investors and analysts reading those statements had no basis for understanding the true financial picture. The external auditors who reviewed Adelphia's accounts, Deloitte and Touche, were aware of the co-borrowing arrangements. They were disclosed in footnotes to the financial statements, but the extent of the borrowings and the nature of what the money was being used for was not fully transparent from the disclosures that were made. Critics of the auditors later argued that the footnote disclosures were deliberately structured to obscure rather than illuminate the true scale of the family's borrowings against the company. The board of directors, which included family members and individuals who had long-standing personal and business relationships with John Rygas, failed to exercise independent oversight of these arrangements in any meaningful way. The audit committee, which should have scrutinized the related party transactions between the company and the family, was not constituted in a way that gave it either the independence or the information it needed to challenge what was happening. The governance failures at Adelphia were not just about greed. They were about the systematic elimination of every institutional check that might have caught the greed earlier and at a smaller scale. Here is what most people never learn about this case. The Rygas family did not hide what they were doing in offshore accounts or secret files. They disclosed it in footnotes. They just made sure nobody could understand what those footnotes meant. Stay with me. The collapse of Adelphia was triggered not by a whistleblower or an investigative journalist, but by the broader corporate governance crisis that swept the United States in the wake of the Enron and WorldCom scandals of 2001 and 2002. Those collapses prompted regulators, analysts, and institutional investors to examine corporate balance sheets and related party disclosures with a level of scrutiny they had not previously applied. At Adelphia, that renewed scrutiny arrived in early 2002, when the company held an earnings call, during which analysts noticed, for the first time, a disclosure in the financial statements about the co-borrowing arrangements with Rygas family entities. The questions that analysts asked on that earnings call were simple. How large were these co-borrowing arrangements, and what were the family entities using the money for? The answers that Adelphia's management provided were inadequate, evasive, and, in some respects, contradictory. Within days, institutional investors and analysts had begun demanding more detailed disclosure. Within weeks, it was becoming clear that the total amount of debt attributable to the co-borrowing arrangements was far larger than anyone outside the family had understood, ultimately determined to be approximately $2.3 billion. On March 27, 2002, Adelphia disclosed that it had failed to include the co-borrowing obligations in its previously reported financial statements. The company's stock, which had already fallen sharply as the questions mounted, collapsed further. Trading was halted multiple times. By May 2002, Adelphia had missed bond payments, triggering default provisions. The company filed for bankruptcy protection in June 2002, one of the largest bankruptcy filings in American history at that time. Federal investigators moved quickly. The Securities and Exchange Commission launched a formal investigation. The Department of Justice opened a criminal inquiry. In July 2002, John Rygas, Timothy Rygas, and two other family members were arrested in the pre-dawn raid on their Manhattan apartment that opened this story. The images of the elderly John Rygas, founder, patriarch, the man who had built Adelphia from nothing over 50 years, being walked out of his apartment building by federal agents became one of the defining visual moments of the corporate scandal era of the early 2000s, a period that also included the prosecutions of executives from Enron, WorldCom, Tyco, and other companies. The bankruptcy proceedings that followed were lengthy and complex. Adelphia's cable systems, which were genuinely valuable operating businesses, were eventually sold to Time Warner and Comcast in 2006 for approximately $17.6 billion, a testament to the underlying worth of what John Rygas had actually built. But the shareholders who had owned Adelphia's stock before the collapse, the employees whose retirement savings had been invested in company shares, and the creditors who had lent money to a company whose balance sheet they had not been able to accurately assess, received far less than they were owed. The legitimate business had been real. The financial statements describing it had not been. The criminal trials of John and Timothy Rygas took place in 2004 in a Manhattan federal court. Both were charged with securities fraud, bank fraud, and conspiracy. The prosecution presented extensive evidence of the undisclosed co-borrowing arrangements and the personal expenditures funded through them. The defense argued that the co-borrowing arrangements had been disclosed, however imperfectly, and that the family had always intended to repay the obligations, characterizing the situation as a governance failure rather than deliberate fraud. The jury convicted both men. John Rygas, then 79 years old, was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Timothy Rygas was sentenced to 20 years. For a man of John Rygas's age, a 15-year sentence was effectively a life sentence, and his legal team immediately began seeking compassionate release on health grounds. Two other members of the family, Michael Rygas and James Rygas, reached plea agreements or deferred prosecution arrangements that resulted in less severe outcomes. Son-in-law Peter Vanitas was acquitted at trial. John Rygas spent years in prison fighting for release on medical grounds. He suffered from bladder cancer and a range of other serious health conditions. His legal team argued repeatedly that his medical condition made continued incarceration cruel and unusual. He was eventually released from prison in 2016, at the age of 91, after serving approximately 12 years of his sentence. The release was granted on compassionate grounds given his failing health. He died in 2019 at the age of 96, having spent his final years at home in Coudersport, Pennsylvania, the same small town where he had started his cable franchise 67 years earlier. Timothy Rygas was also eventually released from prison early, in 2018, after serving approximately 14 years. He too had faced health challenges during his incarceration. The length of time both men actually served, while significant, was less than their original sentences, a pattern consistent with the federal prison system's treatment of elderly inmates with serious medical conditions. For the investors and creditors who had been harmed, the resolution was mixed. The sale of Adelphia's cable systems to Time Warner and Comcast generated substantial proceeds that were distributed through the bankruptcy process, providing meaningful recovery for some creditors. Shareholders who had held the stock through the collapse received far less. Adelphia itself ceased to exist as an independent company, absorbed into the larger cable industry that it had once been a significant part of. The town of Coudersport, Pennsylvania, where the business began, and where the Rygas family remained deeply embedded in the local community and economy, was left to process the complicated legacy of a local founder who had built something extraordinary, and then, in the words of the prosecutors who convicted him, stolen from it on a scale that was almost impossible to comprehend. The Adelphia case remains one of the most personal of all the major corporate frauds of the early 2000s, not because it involved the most money, but because it was the most explicitly a family affair, from its founding to its fraud to its final accounting. Before we finish, drop one word in the comments. If you built something from nothing and brought your family into it, do you think the lines between company money and family money would ever start to blur for you? One word, yes or never. I read every single one. Some frauds are built on greed, some are built on entitlement. The next case we're covering was built on both, and it lasted longer than almost any other. Subscribe.